April 20, 1945. Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. Deep inside the Zoo Flak Tower, 30,000 human beings are packed together like cattle. They fill every corridor, every stairwell, every storage room. They sit on concrete floors slick with urine and vomit. They stand in lines that don't move, waiting for water that may never come. They hold children who have stopped crying because they've learned that crying doesn't help. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, festering wounds and fear. There is no ventilation adequate for this many people. There is no sanitation. There are no words for what this place has become. Above them, on the tower's gun platforms, the last operational heavy anti-aircraft battery in Berlin continues to fire. The massive 128 and Flak 40 guns, weapons designed to destroy bombers at 30,000 feet, are now depressed to their lowest angle, firing horizontally into Soviet tank columns advancing through the Tiergarten. Each shot costs more than a month's wages for an ordinary German worker. Each shot kills. The tower was built to protect the city from the sky. Now it is the city's last fortress, a concrete mountain rising from the rubble of what was once Europe's most sophisticated capital. And the people huddled inside its walls know that when the tower falls, if it falls, there will be nowhere left to go. This is the story of the Berlin Zoo Flak Tower, the most powerful fixed fortification of World War II, and the 30,000 souls who sheltered within its walls during the last days of the Reich. The Flakturm, Flak Towers, were Hitler's answer to the British bombing campaign. After the first Royal Air Force raids on Berlin in August 1940, Hitler flew into one of his characteristic rages. The bombs had done little damage, but they had shattered the myth of German invincibility. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring had promised that no enemy aircraft would ever reach the German heartland. Now British bombers were dropping explosives on the capital itself. Hitler demanded an immediate solution. He wanted anti-aircraft defenses so powerful that no bomber could survive to release its payload over Berlin. He wanted structures so massive that they would serve as symbols of German strength, monuments to the Reich's determination to defend itself against any enemy. He got Albert Speer. Speer was Hitler's favorite architect, the man responsible for the grandiose designs that would transform Berlin into Germania, the world capital of a 1,000-year Reich. Now he turned his talents to military construction. Working with the Luftwaffe's flak experts, he designed a new kind of fortification, a massive concrete tower bristling with anti-aircraft weapons, capable of laying down a curtain of fire that would destroy any aircraft foolish enough to approach. The design was revolutionary. Previous anti-aircraft positions had been vulnerable to bombing raids. The guns that were supposed to protect the city could themselves be destroyed by the bombers they were targeting. Speer's towers would be virtually indestructible. Their walls would be made of reinforced concrete up to 3.5 meters thick. Their roofs would be even thicker, capable of withstanding direct hits from the largest bombs in the Allied arsenal. Construction began in October 1940, less than 3 months after Hitler issued his orders. The primary contractor was the organization TOT, the Third Reich's militarized construction corps, but the actual labor came from thousands of forced workers, prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and conscripted civilians from occupied territories. They worked around the clock, 7 days a week, pouring concrete and hauling steel under conditions that killed many of them. 3 pairs of towers were built in Berlin: the Zoo Tower and its smaller L Tower in Tiergarten, the Friedrichshain Towers in the east, and the Humboldt-Tine Towers in the north. Each pair consisted of a massive G Tower, Gefechtssturm, or combat tower, housing the heavy guns, and a smaller L Tower, Leitung, or lead tower, containing the radar and fire control equipment. The Zoo Tower was the largest and most powerful of them all, rising 40 meters above street level, equivalent to a 13-story building. With a footprint of 70 by 70 meters, the Zoo Tower dominated the western Berlin skyline. Its silhouette was unmistakable. A brutal concrete cube topped with 4 circular gun platforms, each housing a twin 128 Flak 40 battery. Below the main guns, additional platforms bristled with lighter weapons, 37 and 20 automatic cannon for engaging low-flying aircraft. The firepower concentrated on this single structure was staggering. The 8 128 guns could fire a combined total of 64 rounds per minute, hurling 26-kilogram shells to altitudes exceeding 14,000 meters. A single hit from these weapons would destroy any aircraft in the sky. When multiple towers coordinated their fire, using data from the L Tower's advanced Wurzburg radar systems, they could create overlapping kill zones that transformed the airspace above Berlin into a death trap. During the Allied bombing campaign, the Zoo Tower and its sisters extracted a terrible toll. Hundreds of British and American aircraft fell to their guns. The tower's effectiveness was so great that bomber crews learned to avoid flying directly over them, accepting longer and more dangerous approach routes rather than face the concentrated flak. But the towers were designed for more than air defense. From the beginning, Speer incorporated extensive shelter facilities into the design. The Zoo Tower contained 5 floors below the gun deck, with space for up to 15,000 civilians during air raids. There were medical facilities capable of treating hundreds of casualties simultaneously. There were water storage tanks, food supplies, and emergency generators. The tower was designed to be self-sufficient for weeks if necessary. These features would prove far more important than anyone anticipated. By April 1945, the tower's anti-aircraft role had become almost irrelevant. The Luftwaffe was destroyed, unable to contest Allied air superiority. The radar systems that had once guided the guns were largely inoperative, their operators killed or captured, their equipment damaged beyond repair. The sophisticated fire control networks that had coordinated the tower's defensive fire had broken down, but the towers themselves remained. Their massive concrete walls, designed to withstand 1,000-pound bombs, were impervious to artillery fire. Their heavy guns, originally intended to engage bombers at high altitude, could be depressed to fire on ground targets. And their shelter facilities, built for 15,000, could be packed with twice that number if humanity was compressed tightly enough. The Zoo Tower became a fortress within a fortress, a citadel at the heart of a dying city. The civilian influx began in mid-April, as Soviet forces closed the ring around Berlin. Refugees from the eastern suburbs, families who had fled their homes ahead of the Red Army's advance, streamed into the Tiergarten district, seeking shelter wherever they could find it. Many of them headed for the Zoo Tower, knowing its reputation as an impregnable stronghold. The military commander of the tower was a Luftwaffe colonel named Gustav Adolf Hermann. He was a professional officer, a decorated veteran of the air defense campaign, and he faced an impossible situation. His orders were to maintain the tower as a functioning artillery position, supporting the defense of central Berlin. But the flood of civilians pouring into his fortress threatened to overwhelm its resources and compromise its military function. Hermann made a decision that would define his legacy. He let them in. Over the following days, the tower's population swelled from its designed capacity of 15,000 to more than 30,000 human beings. Every space that could hold a body did hold a body. The medical ward, designed for emergency treatment of air raid casualties, became a permanent hospital housing hundreds of wounded soldiers and civilians. The ammunition storage areas, supposedly off-limits to non-military personnel, were packed with families who had nowhere else to go. The conditions were nightmarish. Water was rationed to a few liters per person per day, barely enough for drinking, with nothing left for washing. Food supplies, intended to sustain a much smaller population for a limited time, were stretched to the breaking point. Sanitation facilities designed for thousands were serving tens of thousands. The smell of human waste permeated every level of the structure. And above it all, the guns kept firing. The 128 and Flak 40 was never intended for anti-tank work. It was an anti-aircraft weapon, designed to destroy bombers at extreme altitude. Its high-velocity shells were meant to explode in proximity to aircraft, filling the sky with deadly fragments. Against ground targets, these airburst shells were far less effective than conventional high-explosive rounds. But the tower's gunners adapted. They modified their fuses for direct impact detonation. They calculated new firing solutions for horizontal trajectories. They turned their weapons, designed to look up at the heavens, down toward the earth. The results were devastating. When Soviet T-34 tanks attempted to advance through the Tiergarten toward the government district, the Zoo Tower's guns opened fire from a range of several kilometers. The 128 shells, traveling at nearly a kilometer per second, struck the Soviet armor with catastrophic effect. A direct hit would not merely disable a tank, it would obliterate it, reducing 30 tons of steel to scattered fragments. Soviet records from the battle describe the tower as a concrete battleship, an immovable warship capable of engaging targets across a vast radius. Tank commanders learned to avoid its fields of fire, accepting lengthy detours rather than face the tower's guns. Infantry units tasked with advancing through the Tiergarten went aground whenever they came within range, waiting for darkness or smoke cover before attempting to move. The Soviets tried to destroy the tower with artillery. It didn't work. They brought up their heaviest guns, 152 howitzers capable of demolishing ordinary buildings with a single shot, and pounded the structure for hours. The shells gouged craters in the concrete, blackened its surface with explosive residue, but failed to penetrate its 3-meter walls. The tower stood. They tried air attack. Soviet Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovix, ground attack aircraft that had devastated German armor columns across the Eastern Front, made repeated runs against the tower, dropping bombs and firing rockets. The bombs bounced off the reinforced roof. The rockets left scorch marks but nothing more. The tower's light flak guns, still operational, shot down several of the attacking aircraft. They tried direct assault. Soviet infantry, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, attempted to storm the tower on multiple occasions. They were cut down in the open ground surrounding the structure, caught in the crossfire of dozens of automatic weapons. The approaches to the tower became carpeted with Soviet dead. Inside the fortress, the 30,000 civilians endured. Gerda Hoffman was 14 years old in April 1945. Her family, mother, grandmother, and younger brother, had fled their apartment in Charlottenburg when Soviet shells began falling in their neighborhood. They walked for hours through streets choked with rubble and corpses before reaching the Zoo Tower. Decades later, in an interview preserved in the archives of the German Historical Museum, she described what she found inside. The smell hit you first. Before you could see anything, before you could hear the crying or the prayers or the guns, you smelled it. Human beings packed together so tightly that the air itself had turned thick. Urine, feces, blood from the wounded, sweat from the terrified. It was the smell of a dying civilization concentrated in one place. We found a space on the 3rd level, in what I think had been some kind of storage room. There were perhaps 50 people in a room meant for equipment. We sat on the concrete floor with our backs against the wall and didn't move for days. There was nowhere to move to. The guns fired constantly. The whole building shook when the big guns went off. Pieces of concrete would fall from the ceiling, dust at first, then chips, then chunks big enough to hurt. People learned to cover their heads whenever they heard the guns charging. The children stopped crying after the first day. That was the most terrible thing. Children should cry. When they stop crying, it means they've given up. They've accepted that no one is coming to help them, that their tears don't matter, that the world has ended, and this concrete hell is all that's left. My brother was 9 years old. He didn't speak for 3 weeks after we left the tower. When he finally did speak, the first thing he said was, "I thought we were going to die in there." He wasn't wrong to think that. We all thought it. We were wrong, but not by much. The medical facilities within the tower were overwhelmed from the first day. Dr. Wilhelm Hagedorn, a surgeon attached to the Luftwaffe flak units, found himself treating not just military casualties, but an endless stream of civilian wounded, people injured by shelling, by collapsing buildings, by the desperate crush of bodies trying to enter the shelter. His diary, preserved in a private collection, records the impossible choices he faced. April 22. Performed 3 amputations today without anesthesia. Our supplies ran out yesterday. I told the patients to bite down on leather straps. 2 of them passed out from the pain, which was a mercy. The third screamed until he had no voice left. April 24. A woman died giving birth on the floor of the corridor outside my surgery. The baby survived. I don't know who will care for it. Everyone here is trying to keep themselves alive. No one has the strength to take on another responsibility. April 26. I've stopped counting the dead. We stack them in one of the basement rooms. There's no way to remove them from the tower. The smell is becoming unbearable, even by the standards of this place. April 28. A child came to me today with a wound that should have killed him. Shrapnel in his abdomen, intestines visible. I operated for 2 hours with instruments I sterilized in alcohol because we have no other method. He will probably die of infection, but if I hadn't tried, he would certainly have died of his wound. Is that mathematics moral? I no longer know. Above the nightmare of the shelter levels, the gun crews maintained their deadly work. The tower's gunners were a mix of regular Luftwaffe personnel and Hitler Youth auxiliaries, teenagers who had been pressed into military service during the final months of the war. Some of them were as young as 15. They served the guns designed for men twice their age, hauling ammunition that weighed more than they did, operating mechanisms that required strength they didn't have. One of these young auxiliaries was Helmut Altner. His memoir, published decades later under the title Berlin Dance of Death, describes life in the gun positions during the final battle. We lived on the platforms in the open air, surrounded by spent shell casings and the constant thunder of our own guns. The noise was beyond description. After the first day, most of us couldn't hear properly. Some of the boys bled from their ears. We fired until the barrels glowed red. We fired until the mechanisms jammed from overheating. We fired until we ran out of targets, and then we fired at the smoke and rubble and ruin because we didn't know what else to do. Below us, somewhere in the bowels of the tower, were tens of thousands of civilians. We tried not to think about them. We tried not to imagine what it was like down there, packed in like animals waiting for slaughter. We had a job to do. The job was killing. The job was all that mattered. One night, I think it was April 25th, but the days had blurred together by then. A direct hit from a Soviet heavy gun struck the edge of our platform. 2 of my comrades were killed instantly. A third lost both legs. We carried him down to the medical station, but there was nothing the doctors could do. He died before morning. We went back to the guns and kept firing. What else was there to do? By late April, the tower's ammunition supply was running critically low. The 128 rounds that had arrived by the truckload in the early days of the siege were nearly exhausted. The tower's guns fell silent for longer and longer periods as the crews rationed their remaining shells for the most critical moments. The lighter weapons, the 37 and 20 automatic cannon, continued to fire, keeping Soviet infantry at bay, but unable to stop the tanks that were tightening their grip on the city center. The tower remained undefeated but increasingly irrelevant, a fortress without the means to fight. Inside, the population was beginning to lose hope. The sounds from outside told a story of inevitable defeat. The thunder of Soviet artillery was constant now, punctuated by the crack of tank guns and the rattle of small arms fire that seemed to grow closer every hour. The German radio broadcasts, which had provided some connection to the world beyond the tower's walls, became sporadic and then stopped altogether. Rumors swept through the crowded corridors. Hitler was dead. Hitler had escaped. The Americans were coming from the west. The Red Army had been stopped at the Spree. None of it was true, or rather, none of it mattered anymore. The war was lost. Everyone knew it. The only question was what the victors would do when they finally broke through. For the women in the tower, this question carried a particular terror. Stories of Soviet atrocities had circulated throughout Germany for months, tales of mass rape, murder, and brutality that accompanied the Red Army's advance. Some of these stories were Nazi propaganda, exaggerated or invented to stiffen German resistance. But many of them were true. The behavior of Soviet troops in East Prussia, in Silesia, in Pomerania had been documented by multiple sources. Women who fell into Soviet hands faced a significant risk of sexual violence. Inside the Zoo Tower, mothers made terrible preparations. Some obtained cyanide capsules from the military personnel, planning to poison themselves and their children rather than face capture. Others practiced hiding their daughters in the most inaccessible corners of the structure, hoping that the Soviet troops might not search every space. Still others simply prayed. And some made the hardest choice of all. They left. On the night of April 29th, a group of approximately 500 civilians slipped out of the tower through an emergency exit, attempting to reach the American lines to the west. They moved through the ruins of the Tiergarten in darkness, guided by German soldiers who knew the terrain. Soviet patrols spotted them almost immediately. Rifle fire cut through the group. Screams echoed across the empty park. An unknown number were killed. The rest scattered, some eventually reaching the Western Allies, others captured, others simply disappearing into the chaos of a city in its death throes. Those who remained in the tower had nowhere. The fighting continued. Soviet troops, unaware of Hitler's death, pressed their assault on the government district with undiminished ferocity. The tower's remaining guns engaged targets of opportunity, a tank here, an artillery position there. But the battle had moved beyond the point where any single weapon system could affect the outcome. On May 1st, the Soviets finally breached the zoo complex itself. Fighting raged through the ruined enclosures where, just weeks before, exotic animals had lived. Most of the zoo's inhabitants had been killed in the bombing or shot for food. The elephant house was a charred ruin. The aquarium's tanks had shattered, flooding the grounds with water and dead fish. Soviet and German soldiers killed each other among the wreckage of what had been one of the world's great zoological gardens. The tower held, but the perimeter was shrinking. By May 2nd, the Soviet ring around the tower was complete. There was no possibility of resupply, no chance of reinforcement, no hope of relief. The last functioning radio in the tower picked up a broadcast announcing that Berlin had surrendered. The fighting was over. Colonel Hermann faced his final decision. He could order his remaining troops to fight to the death, which would likely result in a Soviet assault on the tower itself, an assault that would kill thousands of the civilians still sheltered inside. Or he could surrender, accepting whatever fate the Soviets chose to impose. He chose surrender. The negotiations were conducted through intermediaries, German soldiers with white flags who crossed the rubble-strewn no-man's land to make contact with Soviet commanders. The terms were simple. The military garrison would surrender, and the civilian population would be allowed to leave. The Soviets agreed. They had no desire to storm a fortress that had already proven impervious to their attacks. They wanted the tower's garrison as prisoners, not as corpses. And they had other matters to attend to. The war in Europe was ending, but there was still a war to fight against Japan. On May 2, 1945, the Zoo Flak Tower ceased to resist. German soldiers filed out with their hands raised. Soviet troops filed in, moving cautiously through corridors they expected to be booby-trapped. The massive guns fell silent for the last time. and 30,000 civilians emerged into a world transformed beyond recognition. The Berlin they found was not the Berlin they had known. It was a landscape of rubble, of burning buildings, of corpses rotting in the spring sunshine. The streets were impassable, choked with debris from collapsed buildings. The infrastructure that had supported urban life, water, electricity, sewage, transportation, had simply ceased to exist. Soviet soldiers were everywhere. Some were disciplined, professional, intent on maintaining order in the conquered city. Others were drunk, brutal, dangerous. The mass rapes that had terrorized East Prussia were repeated in Berlin during those first chaotic days. Women who had survived the tower found themselves facing the nightmare they had feared most. Gerda Hoffmann, the 14-year-old who had sheltered with her family in the tower, later described the experience of leaving. We walked out into sunlight. I remember that specifically. The sun was shining and it seemed wrong. Everything was wrong. The world should have been dark, should have been raining, should have shown some sign that it understood what had happened. But the sun just shone, indifferent. Soviet soldiers watched us file out. Some of them were very young, boys not much older than my brother. They looked tired. They looked like they had seen too much. Some of them pointed at us and laughed. Some of them said nothing at all. We walked through the Tiergarten toward my grandmother's apartment, not knowing if it still existed. The trees were destroyed, shattered stumps and burned trunks everywhere. The paths were cratered. Bodies lay where they had fallen. No one had removed them. No one would remove them for weeks. My grandmother's building was gone, just rubble. We stood there for a long time, not knowing what to do. Then a Soviet soldier approached us, a big man with a kind face, and pointed toward the west. He gave my mother a piece of bread. We ate it standing in the ruins of our city, sharing it between us, 4 people who had somehow survived the unsurvivable. I never forgot that soldier's face. In the midst of everything, all the horror, all the destruction, all the chaos, he stopped to help a family of strangers. I don't know his name. I'll never know his name, but I hope he made it home. The tower itself was too massive to demolish. The Soviets tried. They planted explosive charges in the structure's foundation and detonated them, hoping to bring down the entire edifice. The concrete shuddered, cracked in places, but held. The walls that had resisted 1,000-pound bombs were not going to yield to demolition charges. Over the following years, the city simply grew around the tower's remains. Parts of it were buried under rubble from other demolished buildings, creating an artificial hill in the middle of the Tiergarten. Vegetation covered the raw concrete, softening its outline. Trees grew on its flanks, their roots finding purchase in the cracks and crevices of the shattered structure. Today, the Zoo Tower is a hidden monument. Most visitors to the Tiergarten walk past without realizing what lies beneath the landscape mound. There are no plaques, no memorial markers, no indication that this gentle hill was once the most formidable fortress in Berlin. The guns are gone, removed for scrap decades ago. The interior spaces are flooded, inaccessible, home to nothing but darkness and the memories of what happened there. The shelter that once held 30,000 people is now a tomb for no one, empty and silent beneath the trees. But the concrete remains, 3.5 meters of reinforced concrete, designed to withstand anything the 20th century could throw at it. The walls that protected German civilians from Allied bombs and Soviet shells continue to resist time itself, enduring while everything around them has changed beyond recognition. In the spring, children play on the grassy slopes above the buried fortress. Their laughter echoes across the park, across the site where their great-grandparents huddled in terror, waiting for the world to end. They don't know what lies beneath their feet. They don't need to know. The tower keeps its silence. The tower keeps its dead. The tower endures.